When the Second World War ended, the entire globe really engaged in a time of competition, a time of spreading ideas, and a time of trying to carve out a new existence. The United States experienced a time of great change, a time of troubled innocence. Between 1945 and 1960, the U.S. economy expanded at a rapid pace. The gross national product increased 250%, and the per capita income grew by 35%. Economic growth occurred more rapidly for ordinary Americans than it had at any time in the whole first half of the 20th century. The middle class grew exponentially. Recall that the Second World War ends in 1945, and so we have American servicemen and women returning from Europe with a lot of new ideas, a lot of new energy, a lot of new hope, and that is really felt by the entire country in this boom period. Union membership actually increased as well during this period, peaking at about 17 million. Though the post-World War II era bore similarities to the 1920s in terms of prosperity and overall good feelings and access to jobs and income, the prosperity of the 1950s had a much wider reach, with poverty rates declining and the concentration of the wealth at the top of the economic ladder shrinking. Recall from the 1920s that the majority of wealth, about 75% of all wealth, was clustered in that top 1% of the country. What we see in the 1950s is the middle class begins to grow, and it grows very significantly, but those lower classes also experience a time of great wealth. And you often hear people say, things like the good old days. And what they're really referring to is this time in the 1950s when it seemed that anyone who was willing to work a little harder and give a little more to a job could truly be successful. They think about this time when poverty was extremely low and the middle class was very large. College attendance rates also increased, making education a status symbol of the middle class as well as the upper class. Recall, prior to the 1940s, before World War II, the majority of people who went to college were people who were already relatively wealthy. Occasionally, some of the upper middle class would go to college, but college and higher education wasn't something that was accessible to the masses and to the lower income groups. Consumerism became an important marker of economic health in the post-war years, with televisions and cars filling American households. 87% of Americans owned a television by 1960. The car industry thrived on the low gas prices, and the travel and fast food industries grew. Chains like the Holiday Inn and McDonald's experienced a rapid growth over the 1950s. So we see that the ability to travel, the ability to eat out, eat on the road, stay in a hotel rather than trying to coordinate your trip to stay with friends and family or in very expensive hotels really becomes indicative of status and income. Now, if you're looking at this chart, what you're seeing is that the gross national product and the per capita income are both experiencing an incline. That means that the United States is able to engage in selling items and keeping the economy afloat, but at the same time, the American family, the average American worker, is also experiencing a steady increase in their income. In the post war years, the rhetoric emerged that suggested that women's roles as wives and mothers were essential to the protection of democracy. Remember from the previous chapter that this idea of the perfect American family became symbolic with godless Russia. And so it became very important that families take on this nuclear mom, dad, two kids view. Couples married young in the 1950s, with the average age for grooms hovering at about 23 and for brides at about the age of 19. Now, this is a little bit younger than we see through the 40s and the 50s during the Depression, but we did see some times earlier in our nation's history when people married much younger. Young couples faced political and media pressure to build large families in the context of the Cold War. Public officials suggested that strong families would build a strong moral fiber within the nation and give the United States momentum to fight the Soviet Union. The development and widespread use of vaccinations in the 1950s gave parents much more confidence to build and enjoy large families. Children were routinely vaccinated against diphtheria, whooping cough, and tuberculosis. And in 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk succeeded in creating the vaccination against polio. Now, President Roosevelt had been plagued by polio his whole life, and his presidency really brought into view this debilitating disease, but encouraged people to believe that, one, they could live a healthy life with this illness, but it also encouraged doctors and scientists to seek treatments, cures, and vaccinations. So the 1950s is an important time of innovation in terms of medicine as well. Now, the number of births between 1940 and 1970, we certainly see a continual increase, but we see the biggest spike between 1946 and 1964. Now, that is a year after the end of the Second World War and up through Vietnam, through about midway during the Vietnam conflict. So Americans are encouraged to have families because they sincerely feel that they can afford to have these large families because the economy is doing well. Now, the post-war years saw the suburbs grow alongside of the middle class. Growing families were seeking more space, fresh air, and the pride that accompanied home ownership. And so they sought to move from the cities and from the urban areas into more suburban areas where they would be able to own a house, where they would be able to raise a family away from the hustle and bustle and the overcrowding in the urban areas. Homeownership and suburban life is really indicative of the middle class because the poorest families would not have been able to afford to move that far from their homes and take on the mortgage as well as a vehicle expense. The federal government created the Federal Housing Administration to meet the demands by providing opportunities for people to purchase homes. The organization provided long-term mortgages to qualified buyers at low interest rates and gave further benefits to American veterans. The government also funded expansion of infrastructure, especially in highways, to ease the drivers' commutes from the suburbs into the cities. The housing industry grew as a result of the increased demand for suburban homes, and the federal government responded by facilitating the process of building and buying homes. To meet the demand for housing, 38-year-old William Levitt applied the assembly line model to housing production in 1948, building 17,000 houses in one subdivision, which was called Levittown on Long Island, at a pace of 180 houses per week. Levittown homes, which came with a washing machine and a television, cost $7,990. By 1950, 1.7 million new single-family homes were built annually. Though suburbanization offered the American dream to millions of people, millions more were excluded. African Americans could not buy Levittown homes. A spreading pattern of residential segregation was supported by Levitt himself, by real estate agents and mortgage brokers, all of whom colluded together to prohibit the sale of suburban homes to African Americans and other racial and ethnic groups by steering minority buyers away from white neighborhoods and refusing to lend money to blacks looking to buy homes in white communities. This was an illegal practice called redlining. Now, what is important to note here is that even African American service members who qualified for service benefits and service loans did not enjoy equal access to those loans and did not enjoy equal access to neighborhoods that they could afford to live in, only neighborhoods that they were allowed to live in. Southern and western states, called the Sun Belt, were at the center of suburbanization, with abundant jobs, pleasant weather, and a wide availability of air conditioning fueling the migration. California absorbed almost 6 million new residents between 1940 and 1960. Miami's population grew by about 80% between 1945 and 1975. Now, here we have an example of a Levittown neighborhood, and to give you just some things to pay attention to in this advertisement, we do see a sidewalk, which is very indicative of a safe place for families with children. We see that the children in this advertisement are riding bikes, so it's safe for your children to be out riding their bikes, playing. We have children over here who are just playing in the yard. You can see, if you look very closely, that this is an open type carport, so the assumption is that the people who live in this neighborhood will have a vehicle. This child, of course, these kids are not wearing helmets. This was pre-helmet days. And we have a wife over here, and she, if you can tell, she's wearing a dress. Her hair is relatively well done. It appears that she's watering the lawn or these bushes over here. I would be pretty confident in saying that even though I can't see her feet, she's probably wearing some type of heels. There was sort of an expectation that women in these neighborhoods were of a certain class and a certain appearance. The television had a profound influence on American politics, society, and daily life in the 1950s, as Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, and the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, aired entertainment programs, serious drama, and documentaries. Television networks also broadcast congressional investigations, which offered Americans insight into the political processes. The networks broadcast nominating conventions, election day tallies, and candidate ads. So the television really becomes a way for Americans to relax and be entertained, as well as a way for Americans to remain informed and connected to urban events and national and state developments from the comfort and privacy of their own homes. Programming for children emphasized the triumph of good over evil and honesty over deceit. This can be seen in shows like The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, The Cisco Kid, and Howdy Doody. For adults, television shows like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and Leave It to Beaver offered depictions of the traditional family values, and highlighted the triumph of gender roles. In these shows, we see, children who might be a little rambunctious, but they straighten up and they behave when dad comes home. And mom has spent the entire day cleaning, and she's made this fabulous dinner for her husband and her children. And, she's in a dress and her hair is done and she's wearing pearls, and she really looks, just out of a magazine. The idea was that entertainment would be a form of reminding people just what the American family should look like. Depictions of African Americans on television were degrading and stereotypical. Black female actors often appeared as maids in programs like The Amos and Andy Show, and other programs would rely on depictions of African Americans for laughs. American Indians were largely portrayed as savages, with the exception of Tonto on The Lone Ranger. Latinos and Asians rarely appeared on television. While television offered an image of innocence in American life, the film industry, or the movie industry, offered depictions of teenagers that were harder, wilder, and less savory. In Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, James Dean portrayed a lost, angst-filled teenager, while Marlon Brando played the leader of a motorcycle gang in the film The Wild One from 1954. The Broadway musical West Side Story from 1955, made into Hollywood film in 1961, was the retelling of Romeo and Juliet in the context of a gang war between the Puerto Rican youths and the white youths of New York City. Hollywood portrayed women in traditional gender roles, and when women stepped out of those traditional roles, they routinely did so to win a man. Film actresses also played alluring women. Marilyn Monroe in The 7-Year Itch of 1955 and Elizabeth Taylor's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1958 offered screen representations of highly sexual characters who eventually settled down and became housewives and good women, or suffered. The term teenager was not coined until 1941. But by the 1950s, teenagers were a distinct social class as well as a cultural demographic, with a disposable income from allowances or part-time jobs, which amounted to approximately $10 billion in spending by 1959. Now, these teenagers that are born and coming of age through the 1950s are the children of that middle class from the 1940s who in the 1930s to an extent, who wanted to give their children a better life than they had had. And so they gave their children disposable income. They gave them allowances. They allowed their kids to have jobs and keep the money that they had earned in their jobs. And so these teenagers really become their own kind of social and cultural demographic where they influence the demand for products, for media, music, and other services. Teenagers were an important market for record players and televisions, and as an age group, they were important consumers of popular culture. By 1960, 90% of all working class teenagers went to high school. This is significant because the majority of working class kids prior to 1960 did not graduate high school. And many of them were very fortunate if they were able to go to school through the fifth grade or sixth grade. My own grandmother, who was born in 1936, graduated, completed the eighth grade, and went to work. So it's important to understand that education becomes something that's very important to people and always has been, but it becomes much more accessible and attainable. The percentage of African Americans who had attended high school doubled between 1940 and 1960. This shift fostered cross-class encounters among a distinct age bracket, with middle-class kids attempting to emulate the style and decorum of working-class students. This is the first time in our nation's history where we see large numbers of young people, teenagers, formidable ages, really interacting with one another in more of a social setting like a school instead of a work setting, which is very segregated. Rock and roll music, such as that performed by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino, and the doo-wop groups, such as the Platters, the Channels, the Chords, the Chantels, and the Teenagers, gave teenage pop culture a distinct sound. Blacks were the first rock and roll performers, but white artists added their own rural flavor to the genre. Elvis Presley adapted performance aesthetics that he had encountered while growing up in Mississippi and in Tennessee. He created his own style and garnered a large, adoring audience, primarily of young women. Elvis's television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 highlighted the generational tensions. White teenagers in the studio audience were wowed by his sexualized pelvic gyrations, but TV standards of decency dictated that he could only be filmed from the waist up. The 1950s were a time of medical and psychological professionals' suggestions that women would be happy if they embraced their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Dr. Benjamin Spock argued in the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, that women needed to stay home and watch their children in order to ensure the success of their offspring. Ferdinand Ludenberg and Mariana Farnham declared in The Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, which was published in 1947, that there could be no such thing as an independent woman. The emphasis on marriage and family shaped women's attitudes about their lives, but many women felt frustrated, depressed, and anxious in these roles, and took tranquilizers or drank alcohol to self-medicate and treat their depression. In spite of the stereotype of women who stayed home to care for their families, the proportion of working wives and mothers actually doubled between the 1940s and the 1960s, with the bulk of working married women coming from African American or working class immigrant backgrounds. Women's magazines also celebrated the career woman and offered stories on Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith, an African American educator Mary McLeod Bethune, as well as female athletes. Women also fought for equal pay through the labor unions. They joined women's clubs and organizations like the YWCA and engaged in politics, peace activism, and charitable activities. Now, out of the anxiety of the Cold War came a mid century revival of religion in the United States, with Americans' church attendance standing in stark contrast to godless communism in the USSR. In politics, Congress added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 and made "In God We Trust" the national motto. In 1950s, 95% of Americans professed a belief in God. William Herberg suggested that the uptick in religiosity in the United States reflected the desire for community, belonging, and security in a rapidly changing world. Television and popular culture spread religious sentiment. Catholic Bishop Fulton Sheen offered 10 million viewers a weekly message celebrating life and attacking communism. Norman Vincent Peale published a self-help book called The Power of Positive Thinking in 1952. This work fused religion with personal uplift. The Reverend Billy Graham traveled the country spreading religion and condemning communism. By the end of the 1950s, the definition of a patriotic citizen required that every American embrace religion. A group of artists, poets, writers, musicians, and intellectuals emerged in the 1950s. Known as Beats, poets like Allen Ginsberg and writers like Jack Kerouac criticized middle-class comfort, celebrated nonconformity, and embraced African American cultural expression, including jazz and an attitude of coolness. In the 1950s, jazz performers stepped away from big bands, which were popular in the 1920s, and began to perform in smaller groups, experimenting with new musical styles that emphasized a unique sound over the dance beats that often served as an expression for racial pride in an effort to critique white supremacy. Homosexuals existed outside of the mainstream norms of the 1950s, but they garnered new attention when Alfred Kinsey's research revealed that about 10% of the nation's population was homosexual. Now, this was not new in that there had never been gay people prior to the 1950s. But what we see with the 1950s is that more people are more comfortable being honest with themselves and others about who they are. In 1951, buoyed by the experience of meeting other gays and lesbians while serving in World War II, politically radical gay men in Los Angeles organized the Mattachine Society to fight homophobia. The organization soon spread across the country. In 1954, a group of lesbians in San Francisco formed the Daughters of Bilitis, which functioned as the female counterpart to the Mattachine Society. However, in spite of forming new organizations, most gays and lesbians stayed in the closet and hidden for fear of retribution. Alfred Kinsey's research offered other revelations about American sexual behavior, including a surprising high rate of premarital and extramarital sex. So this research put into print that people were engaging in sex before marriage and sex with partners other than their spouse while married. Now, again, this wasn't necessarily new. People had been doing this all along, but we see people being more honest about their experiences. Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine offered images of nude women and instructions for men on how to be sophisticated and woo women. In the Peyton Place novel, published in 1957, we see exposed the sorts of tawdry relations that Americans engaged in but hoped to keep quiet. Other authors, like Sloan Wilson in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and J.D. Salinger, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye, offered critiques of conformity, suburbanization, and bureaucracy. After fighting for democracy in World War II, many African Americans expected to win equality upon their return home. Although organizations like the Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, and the NAACP had won important battles during the war, whites still resisted the idea of racial equality. Tensions between the races erupted in 1946 when blacks were killed and their businesses were destroyed in a race riot in Tennessee. Unfortunately, the violence did not end there, and similar instances of attacks on blacks occurred throughout the South, leading the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women to demand political action. Truman responded by creating the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. The following October, the group released a report identifying the problem of, quote, civil rights shortcomings, end quote, and insisting on remedies for the problem. The committee used the context of the Cold War to argue for establishing equality between the races. In the 1950s, the NAACP pushed the issue of school integration. First, the association sued law schools and universities that excluded blacks. In the 1950s, Thurgood Marshall took the helm of the NAACP's legal campaign and succeeded in convincing the Supreme Court to order the integration of the University of Texas Law School and of the facilities at the University of Oklahoma Graduate School, and to outlaw segregation on the interstate highways. Now, in order to understand why Thurgood Marshall viewed the universities and these graduate schools and law schools as important, more important in his view than the younger schools, the K-12 schools, is because Thurgood Marshall recognized that, one, integrating schools with young children was a very big battle that would be met with much more resistance. And so what they did was they used that Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, and they said to the state of Texas, to the state of Oklahoma, and to the United States government, there are no black law schools. for African Americans in Texas. There are no black graduate schools in Oklahoma. And in order to abide by Plessy versus Ferguson, you either need to build a black law school or a black graduate school for black students, or you need to accept a black student into this college or this university. And ultimately, the states had to comply. Now, that doesn't mean that African American students were welcomed or treated well, but they had to be legally allowed to enter. And so Thurgood Marshall recognized that that was the first kind of battle. And then the next argument was to say, okay, now that we have achieved this, we've got to look at the rest of the schools. And how can you make these separate schools that you've provided in the K-12 level equal? The success of the strategy to desegregate higher education was dependent on Southerners' desegregation of the public schools. Under the Plessy versus Ferguson Act of 1896, or excuse me, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case, Southerners provided separate schools, but they were vastly unequal, and resources for black students were minimal. The facilities for black students were very dilapidated. African American teachers were paid less than white teachers, and African American schools did not receive the same access in terms of funding, in terms of sports, uniforms, textbooks, everything. Integration, at least in the mind of Thurgood Marshall, was the quickest path to actually creating equality in education. In 1954, on May 7th, the NAACP succeeded. Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court declared in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that, quote, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, end quote. Now, what Chief Justice Warren is saying is that when these facilities are separated by race, there is no way to make them equal because they will always be unequal. Now, in spite of the court's ruling, integration of the public schools took a long time. The Supreme Court's decision did include a caveat that stated that integration should happen with, quote, all deliberate speed, end quote. But it left the enforcement of the ruling to the Southern officials, to the states and to the school board. And they were able to decide the speed at which desegregation would occur. The Brown decision encouraged African Americans' hopes for ending discrimination. In 1955, the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, Alabama, began a movement to end discrimination and segregation on city buses, with the emphasis on ending the custom that black passengers would surrender their seats to white passengers. Now, this is very important to understand because a lot of times we mishear or mistell the story of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is an African American woman in Montgomery. She was a seamstress, and on December 1st, she refused to give up her seat, and she was ultimately arrested for that. Now, it is important to understand that she was not sitting in the white section of the bus, so she wasn't breaking the law. She was sitting in the first row of what was considered the black section of the bus. So she was sitting where she was allowed to sit. But the custom was that if the bus was full, that the first row that was designated for African Americans would be vacated by African Americans on the bus for the white riders. So she refused to give up her seat and was ultimately arrested. Now, this spurred the Black community in Montgomery to engage in a boycott of the bus system. So, for weeks, African Americans refused to spend their money and patronize the bus. The boycott really instilled pride and strength in the Black community, and walking instead of riding became a status symbol. The boycott inspired resentment and frustration among whites, who arrested the leaders of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that had really spearheaded this movement. Now, more than a year after the boycott began, the Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of the bus system, and the Montgomery bus boycott catapulted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the civil rights movement. King was a Georgia native who graduated from Morehouse College and Boston University and arrived in Montgomery just before the start of the boycott to serve as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He ended up rallying the whole Black community around the boycott. Embracing nonviolence and the leadership styles of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, King hoped to rally sympathetic whites behind the African American causes and celebrated Black communities, Black history, and Black culture. You may recall A. Philip Randolph from the 100,000 man march on DC to garner equal wages during the Second World War. The boycott drew King to the center of the civil rights movement, and in 1957, King and other Southern Black ministers established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to spread nonviolent protests across the South. The growing momentum of civil rights transformed African American communities, but it also inspired significant resistance at the grassroots level and in politics. In 1956, 101 Southern congressmen authored a manifesto stating that the Brown decision was, quote, a clear abuse of judicial power, end quote, and suggested that politicians use all possible means that were legal to overturn this decision. At the grassroots level, white Southerners in Little Rock, Arkansas, used extra legal means to attempt to prevent the integration when the city's school board received federal approval for its plan to integrate the Central High School in Arkansas. Now, we're going to look at a picture in a few minutes about this event, but basically what happened was the school board had to submit a plan for how they planned to reopen their schools, and if they were going to open them as segregated, there had to be a reason why, a justification, but they also had to show that they were making the segregated school equal. So they decided that they were going to open the Central High School. It would be desegregated, and many parents fought this. They did not want their white kids to go to school with Black children, and many of the children and their parents decided that the kids would not go to school. Now, when the school is set to open, the white Southerners are very angry, and so they decide that they are going to do what they can to prevent this. Now, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus fought the court ruling and sent the Arkansas National Guard to the high school to prevent 9 black students from attending the school. Now, President Eisenhower responded the very next day by federalizing the National Guard, the Arkansas National Guard, and sending the Arkansas National Guard and the 101st Airborne Division back to the school to allow these kids to attend school. Now, what's interesting here is on one day you have the Arkansas National Guard who is there under the order of the governor to prevent integration. And the very next day you have the same soldiers there under the order of the President of the United States to allow and assist in integration. But Eisenhower goes a bit farther and actually sends the 101st Airborne Division. The National Guard escorted the black students in and out of school for the rest of the year, but they were still subject to daily harassment and violence. In 1958, Ernest Green, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, graduated from high school. Governor Faubus shut down Central High School rather than conduct another year under integration, but the Supreme Court ordered the school to be reopened in 1959. Other school districts, including Prince Edward County in Virginia, nonetheless followed Faubus's example, and public schools in the South remained slow to integrate. In the 1950s, the Ku Klux Klan experienced yet another resurgence in response to this increasing civil rights movement. They used economic intimidation and threats of job loss, as well as denial of credit to keep African Americans oppressed. Now, remember, the Klan of the 1930s is a Klan that really is targeting immigrants as well as African Americans, but immigrants, people who they believe are not assimilating. Now, the Klan sort of quiets down through the Second World War. And as the civil rights movement begins to grow and develop, the Klan will reinvent itself a little bit. And they will try to find ways to use economic intimidation, the threat of losing your job, the threat of being denied credit, the threat of losing your home. In Alabama, the white Citizen Council members even attempted to prevent radio stations from playing rock and roll because they feared that listening to rock and roll music would lead to interracial contact and destroy white civilization. Now, the Klan is, we have a kind of an image in our mind of the Klan, and we think of kind of redneck guys, drinking beer and things like that. But the Klan did include members that were of the white collar class, of the blue collar class. Some of these Klan members were working in banks, they were working in offices, and the White Citizens Council is made up of kind of the middle class, those with a little bit of capital, who are using their income and their connections to stall integration, to stop desegregation. White terrorist organizations got away with most of their violence and intimidation tactics. In 1955, a 14-year-old Chicago boy named Emmett Till was murdered while visiting a relative in Mississippi after he allegedly spoke inappropriately to a white woman. The alleged killers were brought to trial but were quickly acquitted by an all-white jury. Now, Emmett Till was very young. He was from Chicago, and he wasn't used to some of the social customs that were in place in the South. And there's a lot of dispute, a lot of misunderstanding about what took place. A lot of different stories have been shared. Some of those stories say that he whistled at this white woman. Some say that his cousins who were from Mississippi dared him to whistle at the white woman. Some of the stories say that he was dared to go into the front door of the gas station type place that he went into. Some say nothing happened. We don't know. What we do know is that the woman, Carolyn Mosby, was in a pretty bad relationship with her husband, who was an alcoholic and who was abusive. And it isn't quite clear, because again, there's a lot of mistelling of the story, how her husband found out about this incident, this black boy who was not from the area who came into the store. Some say she told him what happened to keep him from being angry. Some say that other patrons in the store shared what happened. Again, we really don't know. But he and his brother actually go to Emmett Till's uncle's home in the middle of the night, and they're of course drunk, and they ask for the boy, and the uncle allows him to go with these men. And the uncle, if he had said no, if he'd resisted, then they probably all would have been killed. But the uncle maintains in the work by Tim Tyson called The Murder of Emmett Till, the uncle maintains that, or maintained, that he really thought they were just going to give him some lashes. They didn't expect him to be tortured and murdered and then dumped in a creek and weighted down. Now, the jury acquits very quickly, less than 20 minutes, and Emmett Till's mother actually puts his corpse on display in Chicago, and people come from miles to pay their respects and to see his body. And the newspapers widely report the murder of this young man across the country. And with the death of Emmett Till, we see that the civil rights movement becomes more widely popular, more embraced by people who had been able to ignore racism their whole lives because they had never seen the brutal reality of racism. College students and high school students embraced the growing momentum of the civil rights movement and began to use a tactic known as the sit-in, in which African Americans would occupy a space where they were unwelcome because of their race and would move only by force or if they received service. In February of 1960, a group of 4 Greensboro, North Carolina college students from A&T conducted sit-ins at the Woolworth and Crest stores, spurring similar protests across the entire Southeast. In 1960, students who had participated in the sit-ins formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. You'll often hear it referred to as SNCC, which pushed for integration, political and economic equality, and desegregation. SNCC drew on the context of the Cold War and the hope generated by the Brown decision, but its members were met with intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, and incidents such as the murder of Emmett Till. Here we see that the sit-in movements in February are a few across North Carolina and Virginia, a couple of other places, but just within a few months we see that there are sit-in efforts across the entire country, at least the southeast there. African Americans who had migrated west also worked to advocate for civil rights. Groups like the NAACP Youth Council in Oklahoma adopted tactics that were already being used in the South, like sit-ins, to achieve integration in public facilities. World War II inspired other minority groups to fight for equality. Mexican Americans who formed the Unit Leagues in Southern California to protest segregation. These groups often joined other African American organizations to work to achieve their goals. In Texas, the League of United Latin American Citizens succeeded in desegregating movie theaters, swimming pools, and restaurants. World War II finally brought some gains to the Chinese for their efforts for civil rights. The U.S. government repealed the Exclusion Law in 1943 and passed a War Brides Act in 1945. The bill allowed the admission of 6,000 Chinese women to come into the United States.